Okay. And I'm happy to have with us today, this afternoon, this morning, this evening, whenever you're watching the video, Eric Aldrich. Eric works for I360, which is a data analytics technology firm involved in politics on the conservative side of the spectrum. As we were just introducing ourselves here, I saw Eric's got a University of Michigan band there, and as I've mentioned before, I'm a little bit of a University of Michigan football fan as well. Originally from Michigan,
Yep.
Went to Western Michigan University undergraduate, then went to William and Mary for graduate school, which has a really good, growing, I think one of the first data analytics programs.
Yep.
That were developed, and then right out of that started with I360, and I think you were employee number 1 or number 2 if you count the starter.
So somewhere around 6 or 7.
Somewhere 6 or 7.
It's been about 7 years now.
So been at I360 for about 7 years, and started as the data analytics shop, and now you manage the data analytics team there.
Yep.
So this is a statistics class that is not so much cookbook statistics,
Sure.
teaching people formulas and how to apply them in very specific instances, but trying to give our students some real knowledge of survey research,
Sure.
How the voter file is used in politics in particular, and in data analytics in politics in general, and on the data analytics side, probably more what my good friend and fellow professor in the program, Will Feltus, does in terms of analytics that help drive the media buy.
Sure.
But I'd love to chat with you a little bit about how you gather, how you augment, and then how you analyze the voter file. So I think the first question is, what extra do you do? So our students can go Google Ohio Secretary of State, and with a couple clicks, they can download a CSV or an Excel of pretty much the entire Ohio voter file.
Yep.
What would you be doing extra in a state like Ohio that someone just doing that's not going to get? And I think it's also the case that it's probably not as easy to get it in every state like it is in Ohio.
Yeah, so I would start on that last point, which is certainly in Ohio, it's free, it's a simple download from the website, and that is true for Ohio, but across the country, every jurisdiction is different. In some states, you don't actually go to the Secretary of State's or the Board of Elections website itself, you have to go to the counties. And so I360 maintains relationships with all of the relevant jurisdictions, and so we know what those files look like, we know how to process them, and more importantly, we know how to process them into one common format and have built up the infrastructure to really collapse the file that we get from a county in Texas with the file that we get in Ohio in a way that we can do not just state-based analytics, but nationwide analytics. We do that on a regular basis, so we incur this incremental cost in terms of hard costs for the file, in addition to the costs of the process, and then we certainly augment it with other information. So the voter files are sort of the core of our data set. We add on to that, right? We keep that at the individual level, and then we add on to it attributes that we get from other data sets, and that includes most notably consumer files, right? There's large consumer aggregators around the country that are selling to marketing firms, right? If you ever get a piece of junk mail in the mail, it's targeted to you based on the kinds of variables and models that are underlying these large consumer companies' data sets. And we actually acquire those on a quarterly basis as well. I think there's three major producers in that area. We actually have contracts with 2 of them. And so we not only know the information that's found on the voter file, which is different from state to state. You look at states that have, out of the Voting Rights Act, have to ask things like, what is your race of a person? Not every state does that. Not every state has registered party. So we take all of that, and then we can augment it with all of the variables that come along in these consumer file updates.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Maybe use Ohio
Sure.
as a good example. So Ohio's an easy file to
Sure.
get, and maybe as people are listening to us, they can go into their other browser and go Google Secretary of State Ohio voter file, and in 2 minutes they can download it. And maybe we'll even pop some over my head here in post-production so
Sure.
people see what it looks like. But if you looked at the Ohio voter file, you'd be seeing people's names, and you'd be seeing their address. and you'd be seeing different election
Sure.
geographies.
Yep.
And then we would see a marker for, going back a couple years, for whether they participated in various
Absolutely.
elections.
Yep.
And then Ohio is, you do register by party in Ohio, I
I
believe.
think parties usually inferred by something called the primary ballot field.
Okay, so that's a really interesting thing. But so primary ballot field is where you have voted in primaries, or whether you're registered to do so.
So primary ballot, again, it differs by state, but primary ballot field is usually when you pick up a primary ballot, they might make a record of which ballot you pick up. And so then that becomes reported. And so it categorizes people in like mostly votes in Republican primaries, always votes in Republican primaries, tends to split, that kind of thing. So it's not quite as clean as like a pure, I registered as a Republican when I registered to vote, I registered as a Democrat, that you see in a lot of other states.
Okay. So on the what you're trying to do with the voter file is basically measure two things: someone's propensity to vote in
Sure.
a particular election, and then someone's propensity to vote for your side.
Sure.
So Democrats would be going 0 to 100, with 100 most likely to vote for the Democrats, and Republicans would be scoring everyone 0 to 100 with most likely to vote for a Republican, if I said that correctly. Talk to me, even in just an off-the-shelf voter file like Ohio, what are some things you might do to calculate someone's propensity of voting?
Sure. So if you've got, the off-the-shelf voter file will include that vote history that you mentioned. Very common in politics is just to build a simple index. How many of the last 4 federal elections has somebody voted in? Is a really quick and dirty and has been used in politics for years.
So you'll be people hear that those are 4 out of 4s, 3
Right.
out of 4s,
Yeah,
2 out of 4s.
Yeah, you will hear that terminology if you ever talk to any political hand, 4 out of 4, 3 out of 4, 2 out of 4, things of that nature. And so that can get you really quick and dirty, call it a model, idea of this idea of whether or not they will vote.
When you add the commercial data,
Sure.
is the commercial data helping me at all on the whether you're gonna vote, or is it more on who you're gonna vote for?
So I think it's more on the for whom you're going to vote, but it certainly does help on the whether or not you're going to vote, because what we found is that there's not a lot of granularity. Certainly, we actually run this analysis after every election. I360's developed a propensity model that scores every single individual on a scale of 0 to 100, 100 being most likely to show up, 0 being least likely. And that level of granularity gets a lot better, because if you're trying to figure out what turnout's going to be, if somebody's a 2 of 4 voter, you don't necessarily know if they're going to show up, right? That's a 50% likelihood of showing up. That's not really great. There's a lot of them out there. And so adding on some of these, building a model at the individual level and bringing in all of these behavioral and demographic factors, we can really try and identify what traits seem to be common in the people that vote often, and see if we can't find other people to do a better job of teasing out that 50-50. Right? Who are the 2 out of 4 voters that we think are likely to show up? Who are the 2 out of 4 voters we think are likely to stay home?
So that's a really important point. So 4 out of 4 voters, you're not doing much there, and 0 out of 4, you're not really adding a ton there. It's those 2 out of 4s where you're able to, the easiest thing would be to just give everyone a 50%
Sure.
probability,
Sure.
but there's actually a fair amount of variance there, and a fair amount of variance for a particular election. And that's where you're doing your work.
Sure, and so one of the types of analysis that we do after the election is we take a look at what the turnout was, and that's our now expected probability, right? If turnout in 2016 in Ohio, and I don't have the number off the top of my head, if that was 70%, then based on random chance, having no other information, my assumption is a 70% likelihood of vote. And the value that we create then is in each bucket of the model, where do we get above and below that? What is that sort of marginal increase that we have? Because you're right, we know that 4 out of 4 voters, those super likely people, I don't need a super advanced model to tell me that if somebody's voted in 4 out of the last 4 elections, odds are they're going to show up in the next one. And I don't really need a very sophisticated model to tell me if somebody's never voted before, odds aren't great they're going to vote. Now that's Not always true, because certainly more people are joining the file every year. We know that 18 to 20, call it 18 to 21-year-olds, some of them will vote. They will have a 0 out of 4, sort of model score if we're doing that simple index, but we know some of them will vote. And so that's when some of those demographic variables and behavioral variables can help.
So let's talk about that a little bit more. So if you look at me and I'm a 0 out of 4, that says something.
Right.
But if I was 23 years old and I was a 1 out of 4, I'm really maybe only a 1 out of 1 because I only could have voted in 1. Is that something you'd look at to try and make that bucket a little bit more nuanced?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just a little bit on the sort of the structure I360. We have a data science team and we have the analytics team. And the data science team, they're the ones who are hard in the data. They don't have a lot of the background and context of statistics, of politics. The analytics team, we're really, the term I use is our job is to weaponize the products that the data science team uses. So we get model scores from the data science team, and we bring that sort of like, yes, they're 0 out of 0, but how many elections have they actually been eligible to vote in? And can we start to group people based on model scores using that? And so it's really in the targeting component of using some of these hardcore statistic models where you bring that sort of contextual information that really helps.